In the early 1900s, very unusual teeth were found in South America. They were laterally compressed, serrated, and blade-like, much like the teeth of theropod dinosaurs, especially tyrannosaurids. However, these teeth were from Cenozoic deposits, long after the non-avian dinosaurs were thought to have gone extinct. This brought up the possibility that they were late surviving non-avian dinosaurs. While this turned out to not be the case, the true owner of the teeth, Sebecidae, was just as strange. It belonged to a clade of reptiles named Sebecidae, who looked like something straight out of the Age of Reptiles. Many of them were very large, some far larger than any predator since the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. They primarily lived in South America, which was largely isolated from the rest of the world for most of the Cenozoic era. The Sebecids belonged to the clade Crocodiliomorpha, the same clade of reptiles as crocodilians. Unlike their modern relatives, most Sebecids were fully terrestrial hunters. The Sebecids weren't simply crocodilians who left the water to fill the vacancy left by the demise of the non-avian dinosaurs. Instead, they were the last remnants of something even older, Nodosuchia. Nodosuchia was a very diverse clade of fully terrestrial reptiles that evolved before the ancestors of the true crocodilians took to the water. As a result of their terrestrial lifestyle, Sebecids differed greatly from crocodilians. While crocodilian legs are held in a semi-sprawling posture, the long legs of the Sebecids were directly underneath their bodies. Although many crocodilians are capable of moving at surprising speeds, the Sebecids would have put them to shame. Most Sebecid snouts were long, but not to the same extreme as in most crocodilians. Unlike their flat and often broad skulls, Sebecid skulls were generally deep and narrow. The eyes of most Sebecids were located on the side of the skull instead of on the top like in crocodilians. This allowed them a greater view of their surroundings. On the other hand, Sebecid jaw muscles were similar to those of crocodilians, but with their deeper skulls, they had even more attachment points for additional jaw muscles. The theropod-like teeth of most Sebecids, which are called zyphodont teeth, were very well suited for carving through flesh. This is in contrast to the conical teeth of crocodilians, which are better suited for holding on to prey. The Sebecids have been called the ecological successors of the larger theropod dinosaurs. This is not just in reference to their similar teeth. Many Sebecids, such as Sebecus and Langstonia, were about 2 to 3 meters long. This is on par with the top predators of South America today, and prehistoric South America's other two major groups of large predators, the terror birds and the mammalian Sparsaasodonts. However, the largest Sebecid, Borenosuchus, was far larger. While only known from skulls, these skulls are a meter long, as large as the skull of the tyrannosaurid Daspletosaurus. Based on comparisons with its relatives, Borenosuchus is estimated to have been 6 meters long or more, with a weight between 1,600 to 1,740 kilograms. This means it was not just the largest terrestrial predator in Cenozoic South America, but potentially the largest land predator in the entire Age of Mammals, a bit ironic since it was a reptile. With such great size, Borenosuchus was certainly worthy of being called a successor to the dinosaurs. While Borenosuchus may seem like an outlier, its fossils span over 25 million years, about half of the Cenozoic era. Since all of its fossils are incomplete, they probably came from several different species of closely related giant Sebecids. The largest Sebecid after Borenosuchus was Breastysuchus, who was about 4 meters long. In contrast, most Sebecids that lived during the dawn of the Cenozoic era, such as Zulmasuchus, were much smaller. However, in the aftermath of the KPG extinction event, even these small reptiles were large enough to be apex predators. The smallest sebecid lived during the Cretaceous period, before the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Named Ogorsuchus, it was a little more than 1 meter long. The earliest crocodiliomorphs were endothermic, or warm-blooded. However, the bone histology of other Nodosuchians, including a possible sebecid named Iberosuchus, indicates they were ectothermic, or cold-blooded. This means they relied on the external environment to maintain their body temperature. Like modern crocodilians, and most of today's other non-avian reptiles, ectotherms cannot be as active or grow as quickly as endotherms. In general, endotherms are more competitive as large, terrestrial predators. However, global temperatures were higher during the first half of the Cenozoic era, allowing sebecids to remain competitive with endothermic predators. Additionally, Nodosuchians had a higher metabolism than most other ectotherms. Much like monitor lizards, such as the Komodo dragon and the extinct Megalania, this opened up ecological doors closed to more typical ectotherms. Still, sebecid metabolisms were not high enough for them to possess the endurance needed to pursue their prey very far. Instead, they were ambush predators, laying in wait and then charging with a great burst of speed. Once they closed in, they were able to employ some of the best traits of today's deadliest ectothermic hunters. Most crocodilians rely on their powerful bites. In contrast, the Komodo dragon relies on its flesh-cutting teeth, along with the use of head movements to inflict further damage. Close relatives of the sebecids, called Baurusuchids, employed a similar strategy due to possessing a comparatively weak bite force. However, sebecids had both efficient, flesh-cutting teeth and a strong bite. Combined with the sheer size of some species, the sebecids were among the deadliest predators before humans. While most sebecids were fully terrestrial, there were a few ecologically closer to crocodilians. The skulls of the sebecids Saetisuchus and Lorosuchus are wider and flatter than the other species, which is typical of semi-aquatic crocodiliomorphs. Saetisuchus is still thought to have been primarily terrestrial. However, Lorosuchus seems to have been more specialized. Like crocodilians, its eyes were on the top of the skull, allowing it to see while otherwise submerged beneath the water. Its teeth also lacked serrations, and were not as strongly recurved as those of other sebecids. Only one sebecid, Ogorsuchus, is known from the Mesozoic era. It lived on an island in what is now Europe during the late Cretaceous period. At first, its small size wouldn't seem that surprising, as most land crocs were small during that time. However, this was not the case for Sebecidae's branch of Nodosuchia, Sebecosuchia. Many Mesozoic Sebecosuchians, such as the previously mentioned Baurusuchids, were already as large as the later medium-sized sebecids. Although they were large enough to have been among the top predators in a Cenozoic ecosystem, they were outclassed by even larger theropod dinosaurs. One exception was the Sebecosuchian Rayzan androgobe, who was of comparable size to Barynosuchus. It is unclear how representative Ogorsuchus is of other Mesozoic sebecids. It is possible they were all small predators, only later echoing their extinct cousins. On the other hand, Ogorsuchus lived in Europe rather than South America. Since the two continents had been isolated from each other for tens of millions of years, Ogorsuchus had already diverged from the rest of Sebecidae a long time ago. Either way, most sebecids from the early Cenozoic were not much larger than Ogorsuchus, so it is unlikely that any large sebecids were among the survivors of the KPG extinction event. While most sebecids have been found in South America, Ogorsuchus's presence in Europe indicates they were once more widespread. To have reached Europe from South America, Ogorsuchus's ancestors would have had to at least gone through Africa. Sebecosuchian fossils that could have been from sebecids have been found in the Birket Quarm Formation in Egypt. Notably, these fossils are from the late Eocene, long after the end of the Cretaceous period. This means that a second clade of Sebecids or their close relatives independently survived into the age of mammals. There is also evidence that some European Sebecids also survived into the Cenozoic era. Fragmentary fossils of two Sebecosuchians, Burgaisuchus and Iberosuchus, have been found in rocks from the Middle Eocene in Europe. Because of their fragmentary nature, it is unclear whether they were a basal lineage of Sebecids or their closest known relatives. Either way, none of the species found in Europe were as massive as Barynosuchus. Iberosuchus was 2 meters long, while Burgaisuchus was 1.5 meters long. They weren't the only large land crocs in Europe at the time. During the early Cenozoic, Europe was also home to the Planiocranids. Sometimes called the hoofed crocodiles, the Planiocranids were close relatives of the true Crocodilians, who returned to a terrestrial existence. The last fossils of the European Sebecosuchians are from the Eocene. They were likely victims of the Grand Couilleur, an extinction event that led to the demise of most native European mammals between the Eocene and Oligocene, about 34 million years ago. The exact cause of the Grand Couilleur is unclear, but is thought to have been connected to a period of global cooling at around the same time. The South American Sebecids survived much longer. The most recent definitive fossils are from Barynosuchus and Langstonia, roughly 12 million years ago. They seem to have been one of the casualties of local climate change caused by the increasing elevation of the Andes Mountains. As large predators, they would have been particularly vulnerable to disruptions in their environment. An additional contributing factor in their extinction was likely a continuing decline in global temperatures, which left large ectotherms like the Sebecids at a greater disadvantage even in the tropics. However, this was merely the final nail in their coffin. In a way, the Sebecids were victims of their own success. While Notosuchians were very diverse during the Cretaceous period, unlike mammals, only the carnivorous Sebecids survived. As the Cenozoic era progressed, instead of gaining diversity, they lost it. By the end of the Eocene, Sebecidae only consisted of medium and gargantuan predators. A single continent can only support so many large predators at a time. Furthermore, while the largest predators were Sebecids, they faced competition from the terror birds, sparse asodonts, and semi-aquatic predators like the gigantic Periosaurus. Since there could only be a few species of Sebecids at a time, it only took a few unlucky extinctions for Sebecidae to completely disappear from the face of the planet. Though now extinct, the Sebecids were some of the most remarkable creatures the world has ever seen. While other crocodiliomorphs were adapted to terrestrial environments during the Cenozoic era, none of them were as successful or as long-lived as Sebecidae. Additionally, in an era dominated by mammals, the reptilian Sebecids managed to become the top predators. Finally, they reached sizes comparable to the theropod dinosaurs, serving as stark reminders of the age of reptiles during the age of mammals. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Have a great day, and if you enjoyed the video, please remember to hit the like button.